In light of the tragic event in London, Ontario, there's been a call to address anti-Muslim hatred. So federal lawmakers have agreed to hold an emergency summit on Islamophobia this summer. But some find the term Islamophobia either incomplete or even problematic. So to clarify this point, we've invited Kaveh Shahrooz. He's a lawyer and senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and he's joining us from Toronto. Kaveh, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be with you, Natasha.
So Kaveh, let's talk about this word Islamophobia. It has been used so often in this past week, and yet we've heard from many, especially secular Muslims or liberal Muslims, who are saying it's not the right word. So from your vantage point, talk to us about that. What does the word mean to you? Why would it be problematic?
Sure, and I come to you as somebody who's not a practicing Muslim, but somebody who was born into the Islamic tradition and culture. So I have a foot in that world and some stake in the outcome of this discussion. I think the problem with the term Islamophobia has always been that it conflates two different ideas. One idea is hatred of or animus towards Muslim people for no reason other than the fact that they are Muslims. Which I think is despicable, and I think we really should take that very seriously. And we have hate crime legislation that deals with that, and to the extent that needs to be better enforced, I'm all in favor of that. But the other meaning of Islamophobia, or what it could be interpreted as, is any sort of criticism of Islamic doctrine, Islamic texts, Islamic customs and practices. And I don't think in a liberal democratic society like Canada, we should be in the business of telling people that they can't critique religion. And when we do that, oftentimes the people we hurt are, as you said, liberal Islamic reformers and liberals and people that are within that community that want changes made.
So the pushback to that we've heard is that the terms are actually between anti-Muslim hatred and Islamophobia is that they're interchangeable. And essentially what you're talking about is not hurting or insulting people. So why do we need to have permission to critique Islam or insult Islam?
Well, because Islam is not a race, it's not an ethnicity. Islam is a religion, it's a set of ideas and practices. And again, in a liberal democratic society, people have to be able to critique ideas. I can critique scientific ideas, I can critique politicians, and similarly, I should be able to critique any sort of religious idea out there. And the fact that that might hurt somebody's feelings, that's very unfortunate. And I don't think we should be deliberately hurting people's feelings. But hurt feelings is not really an area that the law should be designed for.
So there's been a lot of discussion this week also about M103, which was the non-binding motion against Islamophobia, and you felt that that was problematic. So does it just come down to the fact that the term is problematic, or is the idea that a non-binding motion should not be in place? What's your concern there?
Well, my concern was much of kind of what I voiced earlier. The entire motion centered on this concept of Islamophobia, but the drafters of the motion didn't actually define the key term, and I think that's a problem. I would be perfectly happy to support a motion that says, we should stand up, or the government should stand up against hatred directed at Muslim people. We should be protecting people. But if that Islamophobia concept extends over to ideas, then I don't think the government should be in that business. And you're always running the risk of capturing people that are speaking out against ideas. We don't want them to be called Islamophobic or for that debate to be shut down.
What's your sense? When attacks like what we saw in London take place, or the attack that happened at the Quebec mosque a few years ago, is that Islamophobia? Is that someone attacking Islam, or is that someone who is demonstrating anti-Muslim hatred?
It's a fine line. I think those people are deranged and evil individuals who primarily hate people because they are different than them. They hate Muslims because, Muslims dress differently, they, pray to a different God, have different customs. And that's obviously vile. This attack in London or the Quebec City shooting, these things have to be unequivocally denounced. They are evil. But at the same time, we don't want to overcorrect for this problem and begin to encroach on people's right to speech and people's right to critique the religion. And I'm not too concerned about the racists that can't criticize Islam. I'm actually much more concerned about people within the Muslim community, people that have critiques, people that, believe, whether right or wrong, that Islam is incompatible with human rights or gender equality and so on and so forth. Whether that opinion is correct or incorrect is not really the issue. They should have the right to say that without being captured by this concept of being Islamophobic.
So the federal parliament is moving ahead with this emergency summit on Islamophobia. What do you think about that idea?
Well, again, I wish they would better define the term. I think it's very good for people to come together and talk about, any obstacles or dangers that Muslim people may feel. Certainly the London example is a good one of the fact that, people do face prejudice and people do face dangers. That is something that ought to be dealt with. But again, I really would hope that our lawmakers and government officials would be very careful with their terms because it's a dangerous path that we could go down, and it really could interfere with some of our rights that are enshrined in the Charter.
Raheel Reza was on CBC News Network yesterday. She's a prominent Canadian Muslim activist, and she felt that any sort of summit or task group or liaison that gets set up should not be specifically dedicated to anti-Muslim hatred or Islamophobia, however you'd like to describe it, but it should be about a larger issue of hate-based violence. So whether it's attacks on members of the Black community or anti-Semitism or members of the LGBTQ community, that this is a larger conversation and we shouldn't be sectioning or compartmentalizing the Canadian society even further.
So I have immense respect for Ms. Raza and the work that she does. On this, I would say I'm of a slightly different opinion. Certainly, it's important that we tackle hatred just as a general concept. But different communities face different threats. The hatred that's directed at the Black community is different than, the threats that are faced by the Muslim community. And the people that perpetrate those, may be similar. There may be some overlap, but they may be motivated by different things. So I see no problem in tackling this particular type of hatred and these types of perpetrators. But again, we have to be careful to focus on hatred directed at individuals and not criticism of ideas.
Let's talk about the idea of how politicized this past week has been. When the vigil took place on Tuesday night in London, Ontario, every politician, every leader provincially, the mayor, so many people who are not directly connected to the Afzal family at all spoke, politicized their appearance, politicized the tragedy of their killings, and it left a very bad taste in a lot of people's mouths, to the point where no politician spoke at today's funeral. And I wonder, for you watching, what that was like. Well,
I think it's a good thing that the funeral was not politicized, but at the same time, I do think it was a very good thing for politicians to come out and vocally condemn this killing that happened. I think that's the way that the Muslim community in our country will know that politicians have their back. And the outpouring of grief that we've seen from Canadians across the country and what we've seen from politicians, I think speaks to the fact that at its core, Canada is a good place with good, decent people. There are, of course, racists in our midst. We have to battle that, but by and large, people are good, and I'm glad that the politicians are taking it seriously. But at the same time, I think there are places and events that should be off limits to politics. I'm very happy that the funeral itself was not politicized.
Okay. Kaveh, thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure. Thank you, Natasha.
Kaveh Shahrooz is a lawyer and a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, joining us from Toronto.